So I know the topic is regenerative soils, and regenerative, that word is like pretty hot these days. I think it's like between that and like quarantine, it's got to be the word for 2020. But anyways, regenerative soil is one thing, but when I think about regenerative, I think like very much like the whole farm itself. So in terms of management, I'm thinking like what is good for my staff and myself. When we're talking cover crops, I'm not just thinking about the soil, I'm thinking about pollinators. The snow geese are back, so like we're all part of this living system, and so it's important. It's not just about the soil. There's like all these other components when I think about how we want to manage the farm. So yeah, we do a lot of cover cropping here with varying success. I think Amy was here like 3 years ago, and I think we had a knee-high cover crop of oats in the fall, and she came back in the spring and there looked like there wasn't even a cover crop planted because we have a lot of waterfowl that come here. We have a lot, like we're right on the ocean and rivers, so we have a lot of widgeon and other types of ducks that come, and you can come out here in the middle of the night and all you hear is like whistling from the widgeon. There'll be thousands, so they eat quite a bit. And then the snow geese typically come back in the spring, in March, and we'll just take all the cover crops. So it has been challenging in terms of what credit is available in the spring from a cover crop. So one of the reasons why we added more acreage this year was specifically so we can have some cover crops that we put in August or July that have, and like different species, different varieties that have a lot of growth to them, because what we find is if we're getting a late season cover crop on after potatoes, after our fall potatoes or after our fall carrots, the cover crop is only about this big, and that is just perfect and delicious and a salad bar for the ducks. Where when you have a cover crop, something like this, it's a lot more challenging for them. So hopefully, so yeah, we've had varying successes on cover cropping. So I also want to preface all this that my partner David used to work for Delta Farm and Wildlife Trust, and that is like a really awesome organization in Delta that actually pays farmers to plant cover crops. They also pay for soil liming, field leveling, and things like that, because they can see the benefit of that farmland has for wildlife. So making sure farms are profitable. So it's a bit of like this strange thing where, as much as we like curse the waterfowl and snow geese, we plant cover crops specifically for them to eat. But as you guys can hear, like, they're flying over right now. These guys have been coming down from Wrangell Island. It's like wonderful. I have like my windows open at night and you just hear them and you get tears in your eyes this time of year that your friends come back to the farm. And then it's like the saddest thing that the end of April, you know that any day they're gonna leave, and it's just like this miraculous thing. So it's a pretty special place, and yeah, it's really cool to have these animals here, so we do our part to feed them as they head north and south, and some stay here all year. All right, so cover cropping. Please ask questions. But so we have three seasons of cover cropping. So we have a spring cover crop. So something that we don't get on the fields till late April. So usually by the time we've got our field crops in, that's our main focus, is to get our veggies in first. So by early mid-May, we have a little bit of time that we can start to put some cover crop in. So usually we'll put in something like buckwheat. It's like a quick cover. So here was buckwheat that we disked in at the end of June, early July, once we started to get a little bit like half flower, and then we planted the second cover crop. So we try to do a spring cover crop. So typically buckwheat, it's cheap, it's easy. We do use the grain drill for it. It's really good for weed competition, and it's really easy to break down. If we're going to plant another crop, whether veggies or another grain, the stems are pretty non-fibrous, so it's nice they decompose quickly, and you get a little bit of flowers on there. They're great for the pollinators as well. We have also done field peas in the spring. More expensive. If it's dry, it's a little tougher, but we've done some field pea mixes for a spring cover. And so we'll do a spring cover, and sometime, so that usually will terminate the end of June, beginning of July. And then we can usually get a veg crop in after that, or a cash crop of, say, fall radishes, or I guess radicchio we're still planting in July, radish, yeah, I think I just said radish, turnips. So there's a few crops that we're still planting in July. But this year what we did is we went from buckwheat, and to the spot we did, we call it a biomix. It was, I think, 4 or 5 species. So we have oats in here, and then we have bursum clover, which is this one here. We have phacelia, so both the phacelia and clover flowers, so there was like literally a hive of activity in here for the pollinators. And then we have sunflowers, and then we have Sudan. Yep. So Sudan, it looks like corn, so same family as corn. It is frost tolerant. Nope, wrong way. It will die in about 2 days, so it is very tender, and same with the sunflowers. So a lot of this will winter kill. So there's like a ton of biomass, and I think Drew, you were, and Emily, you guys were out here like a month ago, and so this was like all high, yeah. And all it looked like was a field of sunflowers. You could barely see anything else in here, and it was a little bit scary. This is our first year doing this, and people can correct me, but my assumption is that sunflowers would take a lot of nutrients for some reason. I think they're not a legume, so I was a little bit scared that this field looked completely like sunflowers, and like, am I like, is there gonna be like no nitrogen left, and like what, you know, it looked beautiful. It was great for the Instagram, but like really what, you know, it wasn't serving the purpose of what we were trying to do. So the other purpose was for the pollinators, and as I said, there was lots of insects in here. So the best thing that happened was, I think mid-September, early September, we had a bit of a rain and windstorm. No, it would have been the 3rd week of September. And so the sunflowers all fell down. And it was great because even when the sunflowers are up, you could look down below and you could see the clover coming, and you could see the oats. But now, like, finally, if they're popping up and they're getting the light and things like that. So I still think we had too much sunflower, and we'll change the ratio for next year. But it was a fun trial. The little birds, the songbirds, are really happy with it, but I think this is not going to be fed on by the waterfowl, or at like last resort. So and like there's so much biomass that, like, in terms of like soil erosion, like not likely. So yeah, it kind of was a fun project. If you look at the data, they say some people are all about these cocktail mixes of multi-species, and then other people will say, like, it doesn't matter if it's oats, buckwheat, or whatever. If it's one crop, it's fine. You don't need a mix. The soil microbes don't care. All they care about is that there's cover dam. For us, we're thinking about not just the soil microbes. We're thinking about pollinators. We're thinking, you know, about other things. So it is nice to have a mix based on those reasons. So there's a company down in Nebraska called Green Cover Seed, and they have a calculator as well, and you can go on and pick your top 3 cover crop goals. So you can pick pollination, you can pick organic matter, reduce salinity, microbial activity, whatever. You can pick your top 3 main goals of getting a cover crop, and you can get a custom mix out of that about, you know, what's going to come out. The issue for us, we're a small farm. There's phytosanitary certificates to get big amounts of seeds shipped up here, so we don't necessarily have the whole array of seeds that are available to those in the States, but we were able to get a bit of a custom mix up here this past year. So
on that note, Lydia, I was going to ask what your source was for some of the seed.
So for this was from Nebraska, from Green Cover. We piggybacked on another farm who was bringing in a ridiculous amount, so it made sense to come in with that. So, and it was nice that it was all a mix, so we didn't have to deal with it. This went right through the grain drill, and it was dry, super dry, and it all came up, so that was great. TerraLink is our other supplier for our single crops.
Lydia, when you're looking into like next spring, so now that you've got this mix that has like sunflowers in it and maybe has like a bit more robust biomass than like the barley covers that you might have in other years or other situations, like what are you thinking about? How are you adjusting your plans, if you're adjusting them at all, for like incorporating that biomass? Is that,
Yeah. So we do have a mower, so we'll see how, I think when we have some like thaw, freezing events, depending how, if it's a mild winter and we're not going below zero much, I think this could be an issue that it's not going to decompose as much. But I think if we go through, we'll see how much decomposition happens, but we do have a mower that we could mow and totally basically incinerate it down to like really fine pieces if needed. Also, this here is going to be our quick brassica field next year, so it's going to be like radish, turnip, salad greens, bok choy, and a bunch of Asian greens. So other than yes, we're going to get on early April, but we can this can be a wetter area. This can be a later plant because we're still going to be seeding in September in this field for those crops. So it's not like this is going to be our potato field that we need it ready April, we need the whole area ready April 30th because this whole area is going to be potatoes. So we know that given this biomass and me being concerned that it might be wet, that it is fine given what we're rotating into. Yeah, we'll see, Drew, first time.
I'm excited to see it.
Yeah, so yeah.
Sorry, Lydia, when did you plant this field?
July 6th, 7th, 10th, something like that. Yeah, so.
And when's the latest that you can plant a cover crop? If someone said that.
I mean, literally a week ago, Jenna was with a belly seeder seeding some stuff, not incorporating, so it may have just gone for bird feed at that point. But that was just, we had extra seed and in some of these little patchy areas where we had space. So our challenge is what is actually worth doing. So with Delta Farm and Wildlife Trust, we have until September 30th, and we won't get paid after the fact. That doesn't mean we still do it, but in terms of that program, September 30th is kind of the deadline, or what they see, and which is typical. It doesn't make sense to plant after that because you're not getting enough biomass in the fall, and it doesn't make sense for the birds or really for on our end that there's enough growth. So what we find though is that so we have that spring cover cropping, we have this summer cover cropping which will stay all winter, and then we have two fall events. One is or two fall cover cropping. So one is usually late August. We've brought in all of our onions. There's big patches that are now have been veggies that we have now harvested because it's late August, so that we can go in with a grain drill. Our grain drill is 12 feet, so it's it's not just one bed. We want to make sure it's worth our effort to go in. If it's just one bed, we have to wait until it makes sense, or we're belly seeding it. But we're also a market farm, and do we really have time on a Friday to go out and seed cover crops? So usually we don't have a good 3 or 4 acres until the end of August to go back in and to do cover crops. So usually that'll be oats, straight oats or straight barley. We used to do a lot of vetch. but vetch is more expensive, and the birds we don't get anything out of it. So we've kind of moved back to like straight oats or straight barley for a winter cover. So that cover crop from late August will get like a nice height, it'll winter kill, and we have successes in that. And then the end of September, once all our storage crops are out, so beets, carrots, potatoes, like big acreage, like 4 or 5 acres of crops, we're like pushing it. Last year we had potatoes here, and literally potatoes were out. We hooked up the grain drill, it was starting to rain. That was the last day we could get on the field, and we were, you know, putting the grain in. And so like sometimes like this year we didn't do it. It didn't work out timing, and it depends what we're on to next. Like our focus, we are a production-based farm, and so our focus is fall harvest and getting those veg out. So like this year we didn't get as much fall cover cropping in at the end of September, but I'm like a little more hopeless with that. Like we're not getting a lot out of it because of the bird pressure the last number of years, that there's not a lot of value on our end, or really the birds' end for it.
For the folks that don't maybe have as much bird pressure, I'm curious with the vetch, when you did like a late August planting, were you finding that you'd get decent establishment like pre-grazing, but before the rains came kind of thing? Like,
yeah, for sure. So so things that we've had to do even for our vegetables, like we're harvesting in the winter months. We have our kale close to the barn, so like the birds will only go as close to the buildings and this corner where our neighbors and trees are until they are starving. So the further out a crop is, whether a cover crop or a veg crop, the further out it is, the more likely it's going to be grazed. But I think 2 years ago we had snow, and the snow geese were right up to my parents' house. So like when you're hungry, and you're gonna take more risks. But like we have had vetch like on the other side of the greenhouses, and in the spring it'd be like waist high, this crazy vetch and rye where we've had to mow it down. So totally possible, totally cool, lots of nitrogen there, and like flowering, so good for pollinators as well. So yes, it is possible kind of on these like for us closer to the barn, but yeah, out in the field, further afield, we have moved away from vetch. It's just, sadly, doesn't make sense anymore.
Do you know through the trust funding off the top of your head if there's a like size cap in terms of, I'm just thinking about like for Schoolhouse Farm, like it's okay if you don't know.
Well, it's per acre, or at least the funding is per acre, so I would think at least an acre.
Yeah.
But yes, I do not know.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions on cover cropping?
I'm just trying to think of the question as I'm asking right now. Is there any soils that this doesn't work with, or do you have to do something before that? Then I'm just thinking of different soil types from, say, the Courtney Valley, Comox Valley to here. Like, is there certain things you look for? I'm not sure. Just in terms of that.
In a cover crop?
Yeah, like things that you can do, maybe if it's like the soil has way too much clay or whatever.
The Comox Valley is definitely going to be a lot sandier than this.
Okay.
The Vancouver Island definitely has a lot of soils that are not super clay, and also have a lot of like coarse fragments, or there's like stones and pebbles and things like that. And then in terms of those differences, so you'd definitely expect to have like a sandier soil out on the island. And for that, like cover crops are just going to be beneficial like from both ends of the spectrum. Like cover crops literally are the answer. So it's like, oh, you've got a sandy soil, like you should always get some organic matter in there.
Right.
Use some cover crops. Yeah, I've got a like really clay soil, like you can, because of the things that Drew was saying of organic matter brings properties to the soil that clay would. So if you have a sandy soil, it can bring that. Whereas vice versa, if you have a clay soil and you want some drainage, the organic matter is going to create structure which will allow for drainage. In terms of planting, I guess like I don't know, like what do you do field prep, like you're seeding with like a drill? In terms of like seeding, I don't know if there'd be any difference. Like I guess like making sure that it's getting covered. Yeah, so you're not just feeding the birds, you said.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like the main, so yeah, like we also have a Vicon spreader, so it's like a big drum that, you know, whizzes around, so that is just getting broadcast, but it's like, you know, broadcasting 200 feet or 100 feet at a time, and you can also do granular fertilizer with that. So we do have that one, but you're gonna have to come back in with the Cultipacker or the disc and lightly disc that in, just so, like, especially in the summers, we're getting drier and we're not getting those rain events in the summer, at least here on the Delta, and so you need to make sure that that seed is getting enough moisture, or else you're going to end up with a weedy bed. And same thing, like when we went and when we belly seeded the other day, it's like, okay, well, there's tons of moisture on the soil now, and we're getting rain every 4 days, so that should germinate. The only issue is, yeah, like, is someone going to come and pick up that seed prior? And we did like really, really, really thick to hopefully get something out of that. Yeah. You have a question?
Yeah,
Comment?
but maybe I'm moving away from the cover crop. Could I, or because I see that you don't use plastic, you don't raise beds, and so I don't know what your tilling system is and transplanting. Do you do the plugs and transplant them?
Yeah. So yeah, I can talk a bit about our
Because that's part of the managing the soil, right?
yeah, for sure. So I kind of was saying that the dream is like reduced tillage, and I was down at Eco Farm in California last year, and it was super interesting to hear some of the farmers start talking about reduced tillage. And I went to about 4 different talks on very small scale, medium scale, large scale, like rice growers in the Central Valley, talking about reduced tillage. And I like walked away from that talk and I was like, dang, our climate just is not conducive to like the amount of reduced tillage that I want to do. So we are a heavily tilling operation here. We have numerous pieces of equipment. So we have a plow, we have discs, we have Cultipacker, we have rototiller, and so yeah, we are.
But you don't do raised beds, and you don't use.
So when it comes to that, so
You don't use plastic. How do you weed?
yeah, so maybe I'll just start in the spring, kind of like roughly what we do. So when we have a cover crop or whatever, last year's crop, if it's like kale or something, we are disking that in with that green machine over there. So we're disking in, and we try to wait as late as possible. Like we are concerned about soil compaction here. So we are, even though we can get on and push it, if it's going to not be great for the soil, I'd rather wait 2 weeks to get on. We are going like all winter with cropping and selling that like I'm tired and like I'm not pumped that April is here and we got to start field work. So if I like wait 2 more weeks until like next season starts, the older I get, the happier I am. So we have a really quiet May. We have like no vegetables for sale. We could push it and do like a little bit, but we don't anymore. And so anyway, so we disc the field up. We usually have to disc twice. Like if this is quite fibrous, or like the kale is usually quite fibrous, we have to disc that up twice to get that trash down. And then we plow, so we're flipping that under. So plowing, you know, it's getting those weed seeds, getting rid of them. If the trash, like the wonderful organic matter, has any disease, it's flipping that down. So like we have to think too, is like there's a reason why people...
Do you get club root and...
Not yet. We rotate, we do like a really strong rotation. So yes. But yeah, so like there's reasons why people have moved to cultivating and tilling. So when it comes to, so the Cultipacker, which is the red machine, so that is like prior to, people call it a pulvimulcher, which sounds terrible, but it's pulverating that soil. So rather than rototilling your soil twice to get rid of those clumps, again, heavy clay soil, okay? Like these are giant clumps of soil. This is not sand that we have here. So we run over the field with that machine there, and it is making it into like smaller clumps, so which makes us only have to rototill once. But we rototill everything other than where we're cover cropping. Like we have very small seeds, like very tiny seeds, and like there's like we try in our greenhouse to not rototill, and you can see the germination difference where you rototill and plant and where you like scuff and try to do reduced tillage. And it doesn't at this point make economic sense. The losses are too great. So we are rototilling. you asked about raised beds. So we use
Do you
raised
have
beds.
clay soil? The soil is clay?
It's like a silty clay.
There's like it's a spectrum of like a clay soil, like 100% clay doesn't exist.
What
You have,
percentage
a small
of clay? What
that's
percentage?
like clay.
What percentage of clay do you have here?
Oh, I can't remember.
It would be like probably less than 20%
Yeah.
clay. But clay has such a strong influence on the soil that even if there's a small amount, it feels like clay. Actually, I feel like maybe this is a great opportunity for people to come and like feel the soil.
Yeah.
You want to like walk over to the cover crop and get your hands in there and just, yeah, you can see it's not
Experience what Lydia's talking
technically
about.
officially
You can make
clay, but
pottery.
it is very fine.
This has been amazing.
I mean, what's more clayey than here?
Oh man. There's places in Alberta that are more clayey.
But in terms
These are
of
very unique
Yeah.
soils with how
Yeah.
wet and
which I was
heavy
telling
they are.
everyone,
Yeah.
compared to
like a note.
Yeah.
the rest of the valley.
Great.
How
But yeah,
It's like
other
when I
than that,
go down? Is it go to a different type of?
I don't have anything. Like, I don't have
Yeah,
anything.
so
Except
like
for,
as you go deeper in the soil profile here, it often it will either get more clay, like more fine, or there are pockets where you actually
Yeah.
get into like a sandy
Yeah.
Then you'll
subsoil.
Yeah.
sending us stuff about like
Are you looking
Yeah.
for other
We're on the
farms?
delta, so yeah,
not
we're
for
gonna get
this
a
Okay.
year, but I think like
So there are some interesting
Okay.
pockets of just
So-
like
so we'll
sand
see.
that
So it has a
even
bit more like
Yeah,
that.
and
Lydia
actually,
has
something
better
that was
properties.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So,
What do you think of it?
lots of, like and like
spread of
also
do that.
Yeah. So
Perfect.
even in this, you know,
what you would like to see.
like several acre space, there's like a wild change in texture.
Oh,
which is
interesting.
really,
But
like
the
one of those
management
inherent
side?
soil properties that
I don't know if the
you have
theory
to
can just come out
manage
in
a
a
completely
paper
different
and you
way.
can
Yeah.
get it in,
Yeah.
I don't
The
know,
whole
an idea.
property
Yeah,
to
for
that
sure, but,
white building,
but
that
other people
triangle
might love
building,
it.
Yeah.
You know?
50 acres,
and
but it's
definitely
about
like to
20
include
acres
that.
of
So when we
veg.
if you are
And
able
the
to
rest
build
is
the
for-
survey,
Yeah.
it would be great to do
My
that.
sister's operation building. There's a
I'm
20
not at
acre
the
grassland set aside, a
amazing
3
theory
year set
side
aside.
yet,
Right, yeah.
not
Just
at
for
that sophistication.
grass.
Yeah.
Where this farm probably is.
If
right?
you have
Because
say like
mine's so
a
small.
sandier
Yeah, and same. I think there's a
field
lot of
versus a
small.
more clay field,
Yeah, yeah.
But anyway,
Is there
just everybody has a different
through
need,
cover
right?
crops, or is there anything else that can like, if you're trying to get to more like better soil type, is methods you can get? I just assume both ways, both directions. For that.
Yeah.
Just be increasing soil organic matter, I think. Is that the answer?
Yeah. Okay. Just cover crops. Okay.
Oh,
No. I'm just.
is the question, yeah, totally. Is the question how to increase organic matter? or
No,
is the question,
it's like, can you-
balancing-
No,
Is
how
it-
to increase the sand.
Well, so that's one of the properties that Drew was talking about. That's like there's like the static versus dynamic, right? Yeah. Okay, sweet. So cross real quick, and you can't get a cover crop established. Whereas here in the Fraser Valley, like you see luscious cover crops because we have longer shoulder seasons. But Lydia, and as obviously like here's an exception to that, where of course we have the climate to grow lush cover crops, and then the waterfowl also enjoy it. On the island, you actually like across the board, all the farmers that I've worked with on the island grow like the most stunning cover crops, and they've all got high organic matter, and it's beautiful. Just because they have this stunning climate for cover crop growth, and they don't have water, or like I mean, they don't have like what Lydia has out here.
Yeah.
And so yeah, on the island, it's kind of a good situation for that.
So
Yeah.
the technique, you're not trying to get rid of the clay, but you're trying to make it more dynamic.
Yeah, you're just trying to work with that texture.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So we can't change the texture of the soil.
Yeah.
And I guess to kind of like be really clear, when we say clay, like we're talking about that it has like clay, like properties that are being informed by the fact that there's a bunch of clay in there. Or like a sandy soil is like, it's not straight sand, it's
Yeah.
just like dominated by like the characteristics of the sand. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm curious about your soil out in Chilliwack area. It's similar to this? Okay.
Because we're like near the river, so we were a lake bed. Like all of that area was a lake bed at one point. I know more in like Sumas and sandier because you get like the sod farms out there, but our soil was different.
Because then also, as Lydia is talking about, then when she does till in the spring, then instead of that tillage kind of like lifting up and just moving that soil around and having all the particles fall apart with maybe a bit of like aggregation kind of sticking into it, Lydia's tilling the soil, and the soil will be wet because it's not draining as fast as the sandy soil would have drained, so it's still wet in the spring when other farms would be dry. And when you till the soil and it's still wet and it has those clayey properties, instead of turning into a seed bed, it turns into what Lydia just described of you till and you've got clods, and then you till again to break those clods down. And so there really is kind of uniqueness also in the fact that you're in a wet climate too, and the water, you just have a lot of water in the spring, yeah.
What we're finding though is that it's drying up really fast. Like,
Okay.
you know, we're wet, and we can't get on the field. And in a matter of 4 days, we're too dry and it's a dust bowl.
Right.
So, like, you know, May is super dry now, and that wasn't the case. You know, we'd have rain events, but now it's like you need to have your irrigation for your transplants because it's not going to rain all the month of May. So, our soil, like, it is, by the time we're rototilling, it's dry. Like,
Right.
it's dry, and like, we almost need another piece of equipment because you are plowing and then you're flipping that piece of that tractor to the disc and it's already dried down, and then you got to flip it to the cultipacker. It's like 24 hours. You need to get that because the wind is going. It's drying out all that soil that you need to get it down to as fine and low as possible. It's been crazy the last few years. For 2 weeks, we need an additional tractor, which does not make financial sense.
Do you use overhead water irrigation or drip tape?
So it depends what the crop is. We have like a irrigation reel, so overhead for that for some of our bigger crops. We have aluminum line, so overhead sprinklers, and then drip tape for crops that are going to be in the ground for a significant amount of time. And then, like, we try not to, like, potatoes, we did not irrigate at all. I mean, late blight is like a huge concern. Like, all of our neighbors.
Lydia was giving examples of, like, if there was a cover crop planted closer to the barn and there wasn't the waterfowl pressure, like, you could get away with planting in something in like August or September, and just being okay with a single like vetch or rye, and having that be a cover crop. That's definitely a more standard procedure of like putting down a winter cover crop at the end of the season once you've taken stuff out, or at least in places where stuff has come out early enough. But this is kind of a practice now that Lydia's obviously first year trying, putting down something a bit earlier and trying to get away from the waterfowl destroying it. Yeah. Or also, I think Alyssa was mentioning like just expanding the area of your farm so you can do full summers of cover cropping instead of just obviously what our climate and the birds don't want is just trying to do like short winter cover crops, and that's another tactic to use as well. And I think Lydia, you're also looking at doing some of that.
Yeah, and I think like there's a few other reasons why we do cover crop. One is like weed suppression, right? Years and years of annual veg production. Like if a year gets away with you or a crop gets away with you, like it's really great to have cover crop after that, just to reduce the pressures for a few years. Also, we do a lot of fall brassicas that we're like still picking kale in April from like a May plant, or a May transplant, and so at the end of August, Jenna belly seeded a bunch of clover down in those fall brassicas, because like even now we are harvesting cabbage, and so like there's no way we're gonna get a cover crop in. But you know, if you belly seed like after your last cultivation for us on a tractor, but after, you can, the clover can come up and then you have a little bit of clover. Not like beautiful fields of clover, but you're getting some clover that is just good so that the soil around like the walking paths and in between the plants aren't totally bare. So that's something that we've been doing this year, and see what happens.
Did you find, I know one of the concerns with that sort of approach can be that there's competition, between whatever it is that you've seeded into those alleyways. Did you find anything with that?
No, because it was August, right? And like it's also like we're walking, so it's compaction, so it's not like there's a lot like no, not yet. I mean, the other thing too is like dormant seed. So like if you have something like carrots there next year, I'm not going to be super excited to weed out clover out of like carrots, hand weeded. So you have to also watch too what makes sense. And like, we talk about how amazing cover crops are. You just have to watch, like cover crops also carry disease. Sometimes they're in the same family as the veg you grow, or like it's a similar host. So like I know some of our neighbors do a cover crop, and in the cover crop, like a big biomix, they're growing like big turnips and like daikon that are going down deep, which is like awesome for the soil. But they don't grow brassicas on their farm, but we grow brassicas as cash crops. So you will never see us grow a mustard family brassica cover crop, because like 40% of the crops we grow are that family. And you asked about clubroot, like we're very careful to make sure we rotate that family especially. So cover crops are awesome, but they're not like, there are limitations, or there are issues with having them as well.
Yeah, it's actually a good point. Is like, I love cover crops, and I'd love to focus like future research on that, because there's so many benefits. But as Lydia said, they can be so system specific, and we haven't quite like dialed all of those options in. And there's a reason that they're not being used widespread. And like Lydia's listed a few, like pest bridges and all of those things. Even like watching farmers till in cover crops in the spring and having those actually like bind up nitrogen instead of releasing nitrogen. There's just a lot of, they are management intensive. And as Drew was mentioning at the beginning of like, we used to think the soil was inert, and we just thought it was like inputs, outputs. And you guys are definitely farming in a much more management intensive manner. And it really does require a lot more knowledge and understanding. And I guess with that in mind of like the whole cover crop thing, kind of like dipping your toes in it is probably the best idea, just in case like something does go wrong and you accidentally bridge a pest from like an allium to an allium somehow by choosing like a host plant for your cover crop, by only planting that in a certain aspect or a certain part of your farm, then like those risks are really mitigated. Or other things, if you do end up having some unexpected downside, if you've just planted a section of your farm, trialing it out, or as Lydia's done, like kind of trialing different types of cover crops in different areas, and figuring out what works for you. That's probably the hardest part about it, is that like what's going to work for Lydia here might not work on your farm, but can kind of give you like some hints as to maybe what to try.
Yeah, just from like a disease management standpoint, like you might have noticed that there's a lot of like grasses and cereals that are highlighted as cover crop options, and that is because they grow quickly and can establish quickly, and that's often like a main driver behind cover crop selection. But also they are, for a lot of operations, not a plant that's going to create that pest bridge. It's more likely to disrupt some of those disease cycles. So that's just an additional reason why you probably see those cereals and grasses like highlighted as cover crop options, not just because they establish quickly. And just to go back to this daikon radish, tillage radish, it's sometimes referred to as being part of a mix. The purpose, like the reason that is being incorporated, is because it can grow really deep, like feet down into the soil in some situations. And so the idea is that is creating a form of like natural tillage by creating these really large pore spaces down into the soil, which is something that is of appeal here in these soils. So going back to the question that you asked earlier about like selecting cover crops for here versus for Courtney on the island, for here, trying to select something that's going to drive aeration and drainage really matters. If you had a really sandy soil, there's like no reason really that tillage radish would be of appeal as a part of your cover crop mix. So that's I think a pretty like obvious example. It's very specific, but yeah.
On the topic of like drawbacks to cover crops, one question I have, I don't know if anyone has experience, is thinking about shifting to like multi-year cover crops. Is one pest we have a lot of trouble with is wireworm.
Yeah.
And we've gone, especially when opening up areas that have been like in pasture hay, and then that's gone away over time as it's been in cultivation. But one thing I'm wondering, if we are going back to having things in that for multiple years, is that going to be like against us in our battle against the wireworm?
For sure.
Yeah, ask me in the spring. We have 20 acres in the back has been grassland set aside for 4 years, and we just this fall disked up a third of it because we're going to be cropping veg into it next year.
Yeah.
I'm like specifically not growing potatoes in that area. We're doing some dry beans, fall brassicas, but yeah.
Safe crop, yeah.
Right? Like it's and still there's gonna be issue, there'll be loss in that field. But yeah, like I think like 2 years might be okay, but I think once you go start going 3, 4, 5, like into sod, like or like hay, I think
So maybe a couple years.
yeah, might be okay, but I know it's a huge concern for wireworm.
Yeah, that's a super good point and a really good example of that. Yeah, disease or pest pressure thing. That wireworm's really big with grasses and cereals. They're very drawn to those. But I think what Lydia said, I think like a year is probably you're doing less of a draw, but past that, that's really you're starting to build up populations and pressures in particular ways. I know that there are some growers who have done work even up in Pemberton, like with using brassicas as like a soil fumigant essentially to try to help with wireworms. So I that is a tool that is available to you, but I would say that if you have like a multi-year set aside where you've had grass sod in for a really long time, to follow that up with even with your best natural mustard fumigant, that's probably not, it doesn't make sense. It makes more sense to really approach it from this crop rotation standpoint as Lydia is doing. So
And like, what's your baseline wireworm at now, would you say? Like going into a grass kind of like set, or a grass cover crop for a year or two?
Like how many years until the wireworm?
Well, yeah, have you like kind of decimated your wireworm population since like turning over the pasture? Would you say give like a baseline kind of?
Well, when we first were there, I guess that was our initial, and I'd say it was probably 3 years till there was like certain, like they would just like eat all our lettuce transplants, and it was probably about 3 years.
Of like pretty hard.
Yeah.
Right. Because I think that would
But
impact
it's
it
still
as
like
well.
an issue. It's still a constant issue. But
Right.
it's like at least we don't. It's worth growing.
Totally, you're not
certain
losing whole crops
things.
to it. Yeah, okay. Because I think, your baseline wireworm populations could also feed into that. Of like, if you're, I don't know, you're definitely the pest person.
Yeah,
Wireworm is like
absolutely.
the only pest I know a bit about.
wireworms are tough. Like
Yeah.
there'll be multiple stages of like the larvae themselves, like in the soil. There will be multiple ages, multiple life stages of that larval form in the soil, and so it will take, even if you somehow managed to make it so that there were no more larvae being created, like you completely stopped the life cycle and there were no more larvae going into your soil system, it would take like 5 years for those larvae to not
Right.
have an impact anymore. So the idea, like wireworm eradication is not
Right.
like a goal to work towards,
Okay.
but like as you're saying, sort of you have this tolerance around, we can lose this many seedlings or like this many of our transplants, and maybe we can like just know that we have to delay our planting timing for this particular area that has a higher pressure, because that also helps. So
Yeah, for sure. The plants can grow quickly.
wireworm stuff.
I feel like that's like the most common
yeah.
thing that I talk about.
We've got a big problem, and we have our hens on mobile coops, so we move them around so they kind of follow our crop rotation. So it has been really helpful to kind of lessen the pressure in some areas,
Nice.
but we there was a lot of pressure in one particular quadrant where we're farming that we're going to be changing it up. But it's interesting to hear about the brassicas and stuff like that as kind of a natural fumigation. But yeah, I don't know, because our biggest crop that we harvest is garlic. I think we probably pulled about 40,000 bulbs or something this year. So, but seeing the rotation with the garlic, I mean, you can definitely pinpoint exactly where the wireworm is and stuff like that. But unfortunately, we put our potatoes there this year, so we didn't know. Now we know.
Yeah.
That comes on.
Yeah, and the fumigation thing is really interesting, and I think it can be feasible at like a smaller scale, because
Yeah.
it is a bit of a management thing where you're paying attention to like, I guess like timing. Yeah.
And it works, I think, like for the grower that I'm thinking of, like they are really focused around crops. Their production is focused around crops that are not brassicas at all.
Right.
So
do you see it in a potato rotation then?
yeah, like mostly a potato focused rotation. So
Can I ask a few more questions? Was the brassica, I know, was the brassica planted in the fall or was it planted in the spring?
I think that they do it early in the spring,
Okay.
but I'm not like 100% sure.
Right, and
I
it
don't
grew-
think that if they did it in the fall that it would persist. I don't.
Through
I
the
think they'd
winter,
get too
yeah,
much
okay.
winter kill. Yeah.
And it grew long enough and they were able to like till it in, wait like that week or two, and then they put their potatoes in.
Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah.
And it worked.
They say that it is effective for
Cool.
them. Yeah, and I imagine that it would
I've
like
seen-
reduce,
yeah.
again, not eradicate, but just
No.
like reduce some of the pressure
Yeah.
from what they might have had otherwise without having
Cool.
incorporated that tool. Yeah.
Sweet, that's good.
But the club root pressure thing is like
right.
real big. So if you have brassicas in your production system, like
it's a
Adding
tough
another brassica as a
sell.
cover crop. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. That's a good
Yeah.
point.
I think the other thing too is like where we farmed the first 3 years was a hayfield prior, and like, you know, I'd come in at lunch with tears because like, you know, at like 7 a.m. I would transplant lettuce. 3 hours later, I mean, David probably remembers that, like, you know, 3 hours later, all your transplants would be dead. They'd just be like boom, 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 boom. So, and like, you know, we'd have potato traps and we'd be getting 15 wireworms per trap, and I think the economic threshold's like 3 per trap, but it was terrible the first 3 years, and like it was a major challenge. Then we moved on to this property that had been organic, organically managed, but for veg production for like quite a number of years, and haven't seen a single wireworm, right? Like, or like very rare to see wireworms on the field. And so, I mean, the wireworms will be back in the back field because it's conducive that there's been a, you know, hasn't been, yeah, it's been grass the last 3-5 years, but like you can eventually, once you pulverize the soil enough, those wireworms aren't pumped, right? So like it does get to a point where it is so reduced. We rarely see wireworm in this like whole front area. So that's the good news.
I don't know why I'm blanking on
Fava
other leaves.
beans.
Thank you, fava beans. There's so many, like, yeah, lots of options. The legume family, why those are talked about in the concept of nitrogen management is because they can bring nitrogen out of the air with like the bacteria that they associate with and actually fix nitrogen. That bacteria needs to be in the soil for that process to happen. On organic farms, that bacteria often is there just because we have like all these beautiful borders on our farms that have plants that host those bacteria, so that bacteria is naturally in your soil. But if that bacteria isn't there, larger scale farms buy like inoculants and stuff like that, which is actually just buying that bacteria in like a freeze-dried form or something like that. But you can actually check. It's one of my favorite things to do on farms is checking. Like I just pull the legumes out and you can check for the nodules on the roots. And so you can actually see them. If you didn't know what they were, you'd think that your plant is like sick or something. But you can actually see all the nodules. And so this is on the root of the legume that I just pulled out.
Yeah, it's true. It kind of looks like a gall.
Yes, exactly. Like it would look like it's sick.
Oh, like these little.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And all the farms that I've worked with, if I come across a legume, I pull it up and I check for nodules, and I found nodules on all of them. And so like you guys are definitely most likely having this process happen, but it's worth checking for, because otherwise you're kind of missing out on like free nitrogen that this plant is going to bring into your system.
And the seed we got, because this came from.
Oh, was this inoculated?
This was inoculated.
Oh, okay. Oh,
So-
you're like, of course it's going. Yeah. You're like,
No,
Yeah.
I forgot. No, I mean, but we do like all the veg and stuff. We've never inoculated. We
Yeah.
just didn't have an option.
Yes.
It
And
was inoculated.
Okay, and the inoculation, it actually can be really hard to, like, I swear the only place that I've ever seen it is like City Beat, like an urban farm. I think found some at like Home Hardware one time. Like, it's actually hard to get in Canada.
Yeah, I think I looked into it once too because I was like, I'm supposed to be inoculated.
Totally, yes, exactly. Yes, totally, and a bunch of farms I think are having issues finding the inoculant, and so, but like the first step would just be going to check. And yeah, so you can pull up the legumes. Some of them have like huge nodules on them, and basically those nodules are just like, it's like a symbiosis of like, this is providing an oxygen-free area for that bacteria to exist in, so they don't want to be with oxygen, and then in return the plant gets the nitrogen, which is really cool. But I definitely encourage you to like actually pull up the roots and do it with like a shovel or something, like get the whole roots, because like this would go down and you can actually see the extent of it. I just got really lucky that the nodule is happening right at the top of this one. Yeah. And then the grasses and stuff like that, I guess the purposes of this is like in the spring when you're tilling in a cover crop and you want to credit for nitrogen, like the legumes are obviously like, you're crediting them much more for nitrogen. And I guess that's the thing to point out, is that if you're tilling in like a grass cover crop in the spring, you could actually be tilling in so much carbon that carbon will immobilize the nitrogen, and you'll till in a really high carbon cover crop and you'll transplant your transplants and you'll wonder why they look nitrogen deficient, and it's because those cover crops, as they're being decomposed, the bacteria is not getting enough nitrogen from that cover crop biomass, and they're actually scavenging nitrogen from the soil solution that would have been going to your plants. That's a huge thing that happens to beginning farmers, is you till in a bunch of carbon. Don't do that. But then in the fall, you want to be planting something other than a legume generally, because that'll be sopping up your nitrogen at the end of the season with their roots. Cool.
Budget-wise, like what's worth it? What equipment do you have? So yeah, so this field, but like when we have like huge open spaces, as you'll see where our onions were last year, super easy. Half an hour with a grain drill, done. So I'd love in the future to get more of these spaces done, but as everything, it's time, labor to get it done. We haven't really had a ton of success, so it still is a concern though. Like, you know, what comes out. Like we have here, I think we had dill and dandelion here. So what comes up after? Like these are going to be weeds. I mean, hopefully all winter they don't set seeds. Hopefully the widgeon eat it up, but it is a concern that when you have, if you have bare soil, it will not stay bare. Some sort of weed will go on there, and you don't necessarily want to have a seed set come springs, because I mean, for us, we're doing a lot of hand weeding or mechanical weeding. We're not spraying anything, so weed pressure is an issue. So putting a cover crop on can smother and reduce that. So it's another reason helps reduce that. Yeah. Jenna likes to work out and walk fast, so she, like, anytime she gets on the belly seater, she's just like boom, 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 boom. So she, I think this was like a week ago, she, I think it's mostly like rye, and I don't see anything that's germinated yet. Still lots on the ground, so we'll see.
Oh, you're just picking up the seeds?
Yeah. It's just like,
Oh yeah, totally.
so there's stuff, but it hasn't done anything yet. I don't really know if it will. It was kind of like, okay, one last attempt, so we'll see. I'm not, yeah, anyways, 1 hour walk. If anything comes of it, but that's like the challenge, is that, like, you know, we get rain and like how clumpy the soil is to run the drill through. It's hard to make sense sometimes. We did not. And we're always fighting chickweed. That's like the one thing in the winter is that grows potatoes, like our early potato area got done too. So you can still see though, if you like walk in, there's still a decent amount of chickweed pressure. It's like the one thing in the winter months that just keeps growing, no matter if it's cool, wet. It seems to love the conditions. So what we find is, in terms of bird pressure, they're coming from the dike and the marsh, and they're coming in this way. And so they'll start in this corner, and in like 4 days, like the whole field will be done. It happens rather quickly, but it always is coming from the far end. We try to reduce puddling, anything like that. So like the field's got tile underneath for drainage, and it's all leveled, and there's a ditch, and we like pump the water out in the winter months to reduce the amount of water here, but it's still an issue. They still find puddling, just how wet the soil is. Yeah. To see that tech, and obviously that tech costs money, and like we can't do it on our scale because we're not growing any of those crops enough. Like we're even like contemplating this year buying like a new carrot harvester. Well, it's going to cost $60,000, right? And I'm 35. So I'm like, okay, doing the math. It's like, okay, so if one of my kids takes it over, we'll still be using this harvester. $60,000, 4 acres of carrots. What's the payoff per year? Like, it's like, oh god, but like harvesting carrots by hand when it's soaking wet super sucks. You lose half your crop. So it's like, you know, you're thinking about all these things for the future, what makes sense. And so anyways, it's interesting. I think the biggest thing is like each year just learning a little bit, because I'd love for my kids, if they so choose, to like come onto the farm, and I don't want to like leave them in a worse place than when I started on this operation. Like whether it's like disease, weeds, or whatever, like you want it to be easier for them or not more difficult. And so we'll see. As like, I mean, there's still like a lot of interesting information, like, and on medium scale, because like Europe still has a lot of medium scale farms, and like bringing that information over here, because it's cool.
Yeah, but it's true, crop specific implements, when you've got a bunch of crops and just a few acres of each of them, it's tough.
Yeah.